Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Your Voice, making public comments that matter in federal policy. My name is Rowan Abbasi. I am Assistant Director for Communications at the Middle States Commission on Higher Education, and I'll be your host today. We are joined by Jordan Matsudaira, Professor of Public Administration and Policy at American University School of Public Affairs and co-director of the Post-Secondary Education and Economics Research, or PEER, Center. Jordan is a nationally recognized scholar whose work sits at the intersection of rigorous research and real-world public policy. His academic research leverages government administrative data to uncover the causal impacts of education and labor market policies on economic outcomes, especially for low-income and historically underserved populations. In addition to his academic leadership, Jordan has extensive experience in federal policy. He served as Deputy Undersecretary and the inaugural Chief Economist at the U.S. Department of Education, where he established the department's economic research function and helped inform major regulations and initiatives related to student debt relief, loan repayment policy, and higher education accountability. Earlier in his career, he was chief economist on the Council at the Council of Economic Advisors during the Obama administration. At the PEER Center, Jordan works to bring timely research and data insights directly into policy debates, supporting state and federal decision makers, and advancing evidence-informed improvements in post-secondary education nationwide. So before I hand it over to Jordan, I just want to let everyone know that you can submit questions for Jordan throughout the presentation through the Q&A button that you see on the screen. And so you don't have to hold your questions until the end, but we will start answering questions at the end of Jordan's presentation. So without further ado, Jordan, I'm gonna hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Rowan. Thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for coming. I'm excited to be able to share some of this material about how to effectively comment on regulations, especially those that are issued by the Department of Education. So as Rowan was saying, I spent some time in government in both the Obama administration and the Biden administration, and in those roles participated in the rulemaking process from inside the White House and inside the Department of Education, respectively. And spent a lot of time kind of listening to people who would kind of come in to kind of help give their opinion about how different regulatory actions that those administrations were taking should be shaped. And I thought that um, um, the higher education community generally, and especially those who work inside of institutions, with the exception perhaps of institutions in the for-profit sector who tend to be pretty well organized to participate in this process. But generally, I felt that voices from inside of the higher education community and people with deep knowledge of the inner workings of institutions in particular were often underrepresented in that process. And so this event kind of had its origins in a conversation with Heather Perfetti, where kind of we were talking about how some of the membership of Middle States were kind of curious about how to participate in the process. And I really left up the opportunity because I think there's a lot of value that could be had by institutions being more actively engaged in the process. And I'll kind of talk about why I think that's the case. But just briefly, I want to kind of let you know, as Rowan had mentioned, that I lead a center here at American University in Washington, D.C., that's really focused on producing analysis of data to feed into the policymaking process. And our center does a lot of work trying to help institutions and state and federal policymakers make better policy by producing timely research that can feed into the process. And if you're not already following our webpage, if you go to the webpage, which is just peer-center.org, .org, there's a place to sign up where you get a lot of updates relevant for the conversation that we're going to have today. One of the things that we spend a lot of time on is keeping track of the different regulatory proposals that are currently underway through the administration, and we regularly have briefs that try to illustrate the likely impact that these proposals will have, and also kind of put out kind of overviews of what the key issues that are going to be decided in regulation might be, and how we think the research community broadly, and especially people in institutional research positions, might effectively contribute information that'll help the department make better decisions as it's engaged in the regulatory process. So keeping track of our webpage is kind of one way to stay abreast of policy issues that are ongoing, and to have some suggestions for how to contribute. So what I want to get into today is I'll start with just a broad overview of the federal regulatory process. So in particular, talking about how regulations are made through the Department of Education, especially those regulations that have some bearing on the disbursement of federal Pell Grant aid and student loan aid. And I'll talk a little bit about an example of that in the gainful employment regulations, which I had a part of in both the Obama administrations and Biden administrations. From there, we'll get into just kind of a broad overview of how to write public comments to make suggestions to the department on how to improve regulations. And then from there, I'll get a little bit into the specifics of the current rulemaking that's ongoing at the Department of Education. So I imagine a lot of folks who are on this webinar know that the department's engaged in a couple to a few different current rulemaking processes that are implementing some of the changes to the higher education finance environment that were ushered in through last year's reconciliation bill in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And so there are a variety of kind of very important decisions that are going to be made through regulation at the department over the coming months, all in expectation that they affect actual aid disbursement policy starting this July. So I'll talk a little bit about that and what some of the key issues that people might be interested in commenting on might be, and then we'll try to leave plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. Okay, so starting with just a broad overview of federal regulatory policy. Regulations generally are issued by the executive branch agencies, and regulations are generally meant to interpret the laws made by Congress. So especially when laws are made through reconciliation, the policy details that are included in legislation are often not sufficient to really specify exactly how the law will be implemented. And so a lot of the policy details of a particular law are kind of left to the agencies to clarify through regulation. So there tend to be a couple of different types of regulations that federal agencies pursue, including the Department of Education. The regulations that the department is working on now tend to be in the first category, which are regulations that are primarily trying to clarify exactly how a law that's recently been passed will be implemented. So a lot of the regulations that will implement things like the loan limits or the new accountability regime or the new repayment plans that were passed under the reconciliation bill, those will all be, a lot of the details will be clarified through the regulatory process. The other type of regulatory actions that are common are cases where an agency or an administration is being more proactive in taking advantage of existing regulatory authority that's been authorized by some legislation that's been passed in the past. But the administration has a new idea in mind for how it might use that regulatory authority to change regulatory policy with an eye towards benefiting some group of people. So examples of that were pretty common in the in the Biden administration, where the department tried to take advantage of regulatory authority to rewrite income-driven repayment plans, creating the SAVE plan, or to pass some gainful employment regulations or a financial value transparency framework and things of that nature. So those were all trying to make new interpretations of existing regulatory authority to advance different transparency, accountability, and affordability goals in general. So both of those types of approaches are pretty common across administrations. When we get into how these regulations are written, regulations are usually led by whichever agency is going to be in charge of implementing them. So, in our case, we'll talk about regulations issued by the Department of Education. But regulations are usually worked on pretty closely between the agency and people in the White House who tend to set the broad direction for policy and then leave it to the agency. People in the agencies to really work out the details of how to effect whatever goal the administration has behind a regulatory action. The key kind of pieces that are worth keeping in mind for how these regulations need to be put together is first, there are a set of laws that govern how agencies are allowed to regulate. Those are all generally codified under a law called the Administrative Procedures Act. And for our purposes, I think the most important thing to keep in mind about the Administrative Procedures Act is that it requires that the department engaged in what's called reasoned decision making, or that it have a rational basis for its action. So this is pretty different than policy that's put in place by legislation, where in essence, Congress can pass any kind of law that it wants without really having to explain why it's chosen a particular structure for the law. So, for example, in the loan limit legislation passed by Congress in the past summer, Congress doesn't need to justify why it chose a particular limit, like $20,500 or $50,000 for professional programs. Congress doesn't have to justify why it chose those limits. In contrast to that, when a department issues regulations, it needs to have a rational basis for all of the policy parameters that it embeds in the regulations. And that's really an important thing to remember when commenting on regulations, because a lot of the benefit of commenting on regulations is really to try to either question the rational basis for why the regulation is designed in the way it is, or highlight flaws in the agency's own justification for why it's done what it has done. And that's really a key area where public participation in the process can be beneficial and can lead to real changes in the way a regulation is shaped in its final form. The other piece of regulations that are helpful to keep in mind is that there's a stress in the Administrative Procedures Act on making sure that the benefits of a regulatory action outweighs the costs of the regulatory action, or at least that the agency is being attentive to implementing a regulation in a way that kind of maximizes that benefit cost trade-off. It's doing things in the most efficient way possible. And that's often another kind of hook for public comments, is to kind of highlight a sense in which the way that an agency is implementing a regulation isn't the most efficient way that it could be implementing that regulation. And comments that focus on suggestions for how the agency could more effectively pursue its goal are often effective. So the other thing, as I've mentioned, is especially in the case of regulations put out by the Department of Education, there are always opportunities for public input. So there's always a process whereby the agency has to release a notice of proposed rulemaking and then allow time for the public to comment on the specifics of the regulation. And then the agency is actually required to respond to all those comments and explain its rationale for why it either accepted a suggestion in a comment or why it chose not to accept a suggestion in a comment. And in the case of the Department of Education, there's actually an additional step that happens before the regulation comes out, which is called negotiated rulemaking, where the department has to convene a set of stakeholders and engage in good faith negotiations about what the proposed regulations will look like. So, in the case of the regulations that the department is currently working on, which implement um, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act changes to higher education finance and accountability and other things. The department held these sessions from late last year to early this year and actually reached consensus in each of the committees that it held. So what that means is it negotiated with a set of stakeholders. It kind of made some changes in response to those stakeholder input. But it arrived on a set of regulations that every stakeholder at the table essentially either voted in favor of or abstained. That's kind of what achieving consensus means in that context. And what achieving consensus means is that the department is actually bound then to publish the proposed rule in a way that's consistent with what was agreed to at the negotiating table. So that negotiated rulemaking process, in this case, really led to regulations that were exactly what the department will propose. In cases where in negotiated rulemaking, even one person among that stakeholder panel does not agree to the proposed regulations and consensus is not reached, then the department's not really bound by the conversation at the negotiated rulemaking table. It can propose whatever regulations it deems appropriate in that case. An important thing that's created through the regulatory process is something called the rulemaking record. And I raise it just because this rulemaking record ends up being important because the rulemaking record is just the set of all of the different bits of information that the department considered. And it spells out the rationale for why it chose different policy configurations that it did choose and why it rejected others that might have been proposed to it. But that full set of documents about how the regulations were arrived at constitute the rulemaking record. And if after the regulations are promulgated, any group wants to challenge the regulations in court, then the only thing the court is allowed to consider in that process are things that are in the rulemaking record. So the rulemaking record is an important kind of set of information because it essentially constrains the ways in which the department's actions can be either criticized or challenged in court after the regulations exist. So what things go into the rulemaking record? The record includes, of course, the rule itself, and I'll talk a little bit about what the structure of a typical regulation looks like. But not just the rule itself, but any of the pieces of research or elements of data or other information that's cited in the proposed or the final rule become part of the record. But then the other important thing that becomes part of the record is all of the public comments that are submitted to the Department of Education during the rulemaking process. So again, the way that commenting on rules is helpful is because it contributes to this rulemaking record. It is an opportunity for the public and different stakeholders, institutions to say, hey, like I think the way this regulation is being proposed isn't appropriate because, my data show that this particular, rule is going to have an adverse effect on this set of students, and that really hasn't been considered in the regulatory process so far. That suggests that, the department really hasn't taken into effect all of the costs and benefits that are relevant for thinking about whether this regulation is appropriate. And then that forces the department to explain itself, explain why, in light of the evidence that's being presented to it, it still believes its actions are appropriate, or hopefully it might encourage the department to change its mind to the extent that it agrees with the evidence that it's being presented with, and it might create some way of accommodating the particular concerns that are pointed out by different commenters. So all stakeholders, but especially researchers, people with access to unique types of data that are that might be hard for the department to obtain from public data sources, can really play a role by having summaries of research, summaries of different kinds of data, documentation of different kinds of facts that the department might not be aware of, but are relevant for thinking about the costs and benefits of an action, or whether there are other ways of pursuing the same goals that the regulation seeks to achieve in a more efficient manner. And writing comments that can kind of highlight these issues for the department is, again, something that can be influential in encouraging the department to change its regulation, or in kind of seeding the possibility for challenging a regulation in court if the department's response isn't viewed as adequate. Okay, so I've already talked a little bit about the requirement for reasoned decision making in regulations. And again, I just want to stress that this is really, when you're thinking about commenting on regulations, like keeping in mind this idea that the department is required by law to articulate a satisfactory explanation for all of the actions that it's taking, is key. And if they don't do that, then courts can deem a rule as being arbitrary and capricious, and that's the most common basis for overturning regulations of this nature. So folks who've been around this space for a long time will kind of remember things like the initial gainful employment rules that were promulgated by the Obama administration back in 2010 were overturned in court. Because one relatively small provision of it was deemed arbitrary and capricious, not sufficiently well justified. And so that led to the court throwing out the rule. And of course, the administration went back to the drawing board and kind of refined the rule in a way that addressed that criticism, and eventually was able to promulgate the rule again in a way that withstood subsequent court challenges. Another important aspect of reasoned decision making that I've mentioned is the agency's use of cost-benefit analysis. Again, to kind of justify that the benefits outweigh the costs, or that at least the department's pursuing a rule in the most efficient way possible. In regulations, there's always what's called a regulatory impact analysis. That regulatory impact analysis is where the department describes its assessment of the cost benefit of a particular rule. So that's another section where the department is kind of forced to articulate its logic for why what it's doing has a benefit on net. So what's here is just a broad overview of the rulemaking process overall. So in rulemaking, it starts with, as I said before, Congress creating some authority for a federal agency to issue regulations in a way that clarifies the regulations. In the Department of Education's case, for any kind of rule that affects the disbursement of federal aid, the department's required to conduct live negotiated rulemaking. Then the agency develops a proposed rule and publishes the proposed rule in the Federal Register. And what's highlighted here in red is kind of where we are in the process right now. We're kind of between, for some of the actions the department is taking, we're in the public comment period. So there's a rulemaking that's happening right now related to the new loan limits and the income-driven repayment plans that have been proposed or that have been put in law by the reconciliation bill. And that regulation has already been proposed. There's a notice of proposed rulemaking that came out a couple of weeks ago, and the comments on that rule are due on March 2nd, which is next Monday, I believe. There's going to be another set of proposed rules that will be issued kind of any day now, but sometime in the coming month. In all likelihood, that will be more related to the accountability provisions of the bill, and will cover both the implementing regulations behind the accountability framework in OBBBA, and also modifications to the gainful employment and financial value transparency regulations. So those regulations are on their way soon. They haven't yet been published in the Federal Register. After the comment period is over, so the comment period at minimum needs to be 30 days. And in recent years, in recent administrations, the Department of Education has generally been giving commenters not much more time than this. So it used to be that regulations were published and the public were given closer to 90 days to comment, and then 60 days was more common. In these days, it's getting more and more common for the department to give the minimum amount of time for the community to comment on regulations, which is 30 days. After the public comment period is over, the agency is required to respond to all of those public comments and make revisions to the rule. Generally, the next public step in the process is the agency issuing a final rule in the Federal Register. And in that final rule, there will be a very long section of a summary of all of the different comments that are made during the comment period, followed by the department's response to each one of those comments. So, there will be a list of all of the different issues, all of the different topic areas that commenters make on the rule. They'll say things like, well, we think a particular other field should be eligible for a $50,000 loan limit because it's a professional program. And the department will either say, we agree with the commenter and we're going to consider that program to be a professional program for the purposes of the new loan limits, or no, we don't agree, and here's kind of our logic for why that's the case. So after the federal rule is out, then the rule is considered final, and the agency will turn to implementation of the final rule. In the timeline that we're on right now, the gap between those things is going to be incredibly abrupt. The final rule will probably come out in June well, it's probably sometime in June, but they'll go into effect almost immediately because the law requires that a lot of these provisions take effect on July 1st. So implementation will come very rapidly. Let me just briefly give a sense for how these things work in the context of a particular regulation that I worked on in the past, which is the gainful employment rule. As I've mentioned, well, let me back up. For folks who are not familiar with the gainful employment regulations, the gainful employment regulations were first enacted by the Obama administration in 2010. Kind of were driven by a concern that there were very bad outcomes for a lot of borrowers, particularly in the for-profit sector. And the Obama administration took advantage of a provision in the Higher Education Act that said that programs were considered eligible for federal financial aid only if they prepare students for gainful employment in a recognized occupation. But that term or that sentence, what it means to prepare students for gainful employment in a recognized occupation, had not been defined or operationalized previously. So the department wrote regulations essentially that operationalized that term. And the way they operationalized it was to say that, what that term means is that students have a reasonable amount of debt relative to the earnings that they make. So they defined a debt relative to earnings ratio and said that programs would not be eligible if the amount of money that people had to pay to service their debt every year exceeded a certain fraction of their income. So those rules were challenged right away, and like I said, initially thrown out by the courts. The rules were repromulgated in 2015, but then rescinded in the first Trump administration, and then repromulgated in 2023 under the Biden administration. each time these GE regulations garnered tens of thousands of public comments. And a lot of those comments contained criticisms that became the subsequent basis for a lawsuit. So they were things that said things like, um, the earnings that are measured by the IRS, like, don't capture a lot of the earnings of people who worked in tipped professions, and so because of that, this kind of system is unfair to programs that have a lot of graduates who go on to work in those professions. In numerous other kind of critiques as well. In the 2023 rule, the department was really meticulous. I say with a bit of pride, having been behind a lot of the writing on these regulations here, in kind of taking good care to justify as best we were able all of the different actions that were proposed in those rules. So there's a lot of research that's cited that explains why some of these critiques are not well founded. There are studies that are cited that explain that over time the share of income that goes unreported to the IRS has diminished, and it's now so small that if you were able to include it, it wouldn't meaningfully change the set of programs that are kind of flagged as failing the gainful employment rules. There was a lot of care taken to kind of justifying all of these different steps and carefully responding to all of the comments. And through that process, the rule was strengthened to the point where even when it was challenged in a relatively conservative court in the Fifth District of Texas, the judge kind of upheld the regulations as legal, and really noted like all of the research that justified all of the actions taken in the way in which the department had carefully responded to all of the critiques that became the basis of the lawsuit. So the key thing here is really that in that regulatory record, exchange in between public comments pointing out flaws with the proposed rules and the department's explanations of why the proposals in the regulation were justified despite the kind of flaws pointed out by commenters. The judge upheld the rule, so that hasn't always been true. But I think illustrates the importance of both the public comments and pointing out potential flaws, and then insisting on the quality of the department's responses in the regulation, and that having that combination or that comparison of things really being the thing that determines the fate of whether the regulation continues to survive or not. So with that backdrop, let me turn to some advice on writing public comments on participating in this process. So the first step in writing effective comments is just kind of knowing what's happening. So in order to write an effective comment, it's really important to know exactly what policy dials are being specified in a regulation. And knowing in particular what things the department has the authority to change and what things have been fully kind of specified by the legislation. In writing regulations, the department can't just do whatever it wants. It has to really just be clarifying things that are left uncertain in legislation. And so to the extent that something is kind of fully specified and very clear in statute, then the department is not going to be able to change that. So, for example, in the new loan limits for graduate students, the department's not going to be able to change whether the loan limit is $20,500 or $50,000. That's very clear that those are the two loan limits that Congress wants to be applied to graduate lending. An area where there's less clarity in the regulation is around exactly which programs are considered professional and which ones aren't. So kind of understanding the difference between things that the department can affect through its regulations or can't, because it's already been clarified in statute is kind of a first step. Regulations are usually published in the Federal Register, and so tracking this page on the Federal Register is one way to stay up to date. And then the other way, as I was saying before, that you can stay up to date is to sign up for our weekly newsletter from the Peer Center, where we forecast all of the major regulatory proposals that are coming down the pike. And for a lot of them, we put out a specific brief that gives suggestions for researchers and people with data on like what particular issues might help to provide information to the department to help clarify. And I'll come back to that and give you some examples related to the recent regulations. So, what kinds of comments make an impact? So, going back to what I said before, the key thing is really any kind of data analysis, evidence that helps either question the rational basis of what the department is doing or questions whether the actions kind of taken by the department are cost beneficial. Are very helpful, right? That's the kind of key ingredient that the department needs to kind of be conscious of when it's writing regulations. And so providing comments that really help illustrate why the kind of cost benefit analysis of the department is off, or like why a particular policy that it's pursuing might have consequences that are other than what it says, is the most important kind of information to present. So the kinds of evidence that could be helpful, or the kind of things to put in a comment that could be helpful, are things like summarizing existing research on a particular policy area that's under consideration, is especially things that might not be reflected in the department's justification for what it's doing in its proposed regulations, can be very helpful. One of the things that I think that institutions can be most helpful on is on issues of measurement. So a lot of the time when the department is issuing regulations, it's relying on the kind of subset of data that it has within the National Student Loan Data System to produce metrics that it will use to measure performance in different regards, and then kind of tie sanctions or other things to those to the data that it has available to it. But that data is only a very poor approximation for the rich data that institutions have in their institutional research offices on, all of the different characteristics of students, and all of their kind of financial aid information and other kinds of things that help contribute to whether students are successful or not. So institutions are always going to have more detailed data than the department has at its disposal. And because of that, I think one particularly effective line of commenting in a lot of cases might be just suggesting better ways of measuring different concepts, or illustrating for the department why its proposed way of measuring something, might not be accurate in certain cases, and kind of pointing out exactly what those cases might be. It's always important to consider feasibility. So the department's not required in its regulations to use perfect data that it might not have. It's just required to use the best data that it has available for the task at hand. So I think these kinds of comments on measurement, the kind of comment that could be particularly helpful is kind of illustrating the flaws of a particular measurement approach that the department is proposing, and then hopefully proposing like a different way of measuring things and illustrating for them why that might avoid particular pitfalls or mistakes that would be inherent in the measurement approach that the department's taking. Kind of similar to that, any kind of feedback on the data that the department is using, whether it's reliable or not. And again, illustrating with the superior data that institutions tend to have, like why the department might be making faulty conclusions based on the department that it has, but with better data, the conclusion that you would arrive at might be different. Information like that, I think, has the potential to be incredibly valuable to the rulemaking process, because again, it just shines a brighter light on a particular set of issues, and might prevent the department from making faulty conclusions based on the less rich data that it has available to it. In any regulation, the way to consume a notice of proposed, or the way to consume proposed regulation is, the regulation will come in three different broad sections. So the first part, and I'm talking about the figure that's here on the right side of the slide. In the first part is the preamble. So the preamble tends to be, the department's statement of what it thinks the policy problem is that these regulations are designed to solve, and then a description of what it's actually going to do, like what are the things that it's proposing to change in regulation. And this is where the department is really meant to articulate what its rational basis is for why it believes the changes that it's making are going to be beneficial. So it's basically a narrative form of what the regulation is and why the department thinks it's important. The second part that usually follows that preamble is the regulatory impact analysis. And that's, as I said earlier, where the department highlights its analysis of the costs and benefits of the different proposal. And then finally, at the end of the regulation is the actual regulatory text. So this is really the actual legal language that will end up in the Code of Federal Regulations that the department is proposing. So everything that comes before that regulatory text is just a more narrative description of what those changes to the regulatory text will be. So as you kind of digest these different pieces, the preamble is, again, the argument about why the department thinks the changes it's making are going to be beneficial. There are going to be citations to research, presentations of different data analyses that are all designed to justify, to kind of lay out the kind of reason basis for why the department thinks what it's doing is a good thing. And this is really the public's opportunity to look at all of these different arguments, and to the extent that you disagree with the arguments being made, to come up with hopefully better data, different analyses, like citations for different kinds of research that point out that either you think what the regulator is doing is inappropriate because they don't have the right data, they are misunderstanding the research or things of that nature. I should stress it's also very helpful for the department when elements of a regulation are things that you agree with, to note that you agree with it. So comments that are expressing support for different provisions in a regulation are also very impactful. Impactful in part because there are often people who both agree and disagree with particular provisions. And it's very helpful for the department to hear both sides of that set of concerns when it's considering whether to make changes to regulations. If it only hears from one side, then directionally, it's only going to be able to make changes in one direction. So that's the preamble. The regulatory impact analysis, again, has some similar components to it, but some of the analysis of costs and benefits tend to be a little bit more technical. They should be more tethered to data analysis and notions of like how this regulatory change is going to impact student behavior or institution behavior and things of that nature. So being able to highlight research that kind of illustrates especially evaluation research that points to what we know about the true effects of these kinds of changes can be particularly helpful. So other tips. As I've said, being constructive, the agency, like given that it's put out proposed change to regulations, is likely to do something in its final set of regulations. So just saying, don't do this, like this is all a bad idea, that's valuable, but I think is unlikely to be completely successful in most cases. So rather than kind of getting the agency to kind of back off of a set of policy changes full stop, trying to kind of corral them in a direction that's more productive by again suggesting alternatives that might be better, that might better pursue the policy goals that the department claims to be trying to affect is often a more effective way to make comments on the regulations. Another big thing is you don't need to feel like you need to make a comment on all aspects of the regulation. It could be a regulation that's 500 pages long, and there might just be one small provision that you feel like you know something about, like you have data that's really um, illuminating in kind of helping the department understand like how this parameter ought to be tweaked. Sticking to a single issue and having a comment that's just very focused on one thing, but providing really high quality advice and data to the department can be very impactful. And I can think of a lot of examples of comments like that that have really changed regulations in important ways. Um, Presenting any kind of research can be helpful. I often give this talk to academic researchers and stress using credible evidence. Like peer-reviewed articles are fine, but it doesn't need to be that. It just needs to be something that's credible, that the department can really rely on as being true. From an institution's perspective, again, I think one of the most valuable things that can be contributed is, detailed information that you have that nobody else would have. That might be really helpful for understanding, for the department's understanding of how a particular tweak to a regulation is going to affect your institution or your students or things of that nature. Briefly, a couple of examples of comments just to give you a sense for how brief these can be. Again, these are comments from academics, so tend to focus a little bit more on overviews of bodies of academic research and things of that nature. But these are comments on the gainful employment rules that were submitted during the Trump administration's rescission rulemaking that ended up in the rescission of those rules. But you can see here, that the points made are really quite brief. What you see is just the kind of opening for the public comments here, but you can easily find these comments in the public record on the rules. But you can see that the things that these comments have in common are just concisely stating the key points that they're going to make at the top, like pointing to bodies of knowledge that the proposed rule does not engage with, and kind of flagging that there's a set of evidence that's important to consider that the rule hasn't considered already. And then a focus on, again, costs and benefits of the rule overall. Another thing that's helpful is just adding support for other comments that have already been made. So in the rulemaking process, all submitted comments are things that you can view on the page where you submit the comments. So you can, while comments are being submitted, you can view comments that have already been submitted. And submitting comments that just add support for comments that have already been submitted are also helpful because it gives the department, again, a better sense for the weight of how many people in the community support different kinds of actions. Let me quickly turn to the current rulemaking and then hopefully wrap up to leave some time for questions. So the RISE committee is the committee where it met over the fall and reached consensus on changes to loan limits for both Graduate Plus and Parent Plus and the implementation of the repayment assistance plan. That committee reached consensus on a variety of different things and has already released its proposed rule. And comments are due, like I said, next Monday on this rule. Some of the most important decision points in regulation here are exactly what the definition will be for graduate programs versus professional programs. So which academic programs will be eligible for the higher $50,000 loan limit for graduate students. But there are other things as well. So one of the things in the law was a requirement that loan limits be prorated based on students' enrollment intensity. And that change is scheduled to go into effect right away on July 1st. One of the things that was discussed at the rulemaking table, but the department ultimately decided not to do, was whether there should be a phase-in for part-time students who are already enrolled, so they don't get a rude surprise in a total change in the environment of how they're going to finance their education come this July 1st. So that's another area where presenting the department with data on how many of your students might be affected and how could be impactful. And then finally, there's a set of one of the provisions of the OBBBA was giving institutions the authority to determine their own loan limits that are lower than the federal limits for particular programs, as long as they do that in a way that's consistent across all students who are enrolled in that program. So there are essentially no guidelines that have been given to institutions as to what kind of communication they might need to engage in with students before policies like that are put into place, or kind of any other kind of restrictions on that eligibility. And that's another area where, from your perspective, from working in institutions, I think comments to the department either kind of supporting the lack of like additional instructions, or in the other direction on kind of suggesting like what kinds of communication might be appropriate for all institutions to be taking to explain these changes to students could be impactful. I do suspect that the department will consider making modifications to those provisions. So that's the rule that's already out for comment right now. The next set of issues that we should see a NPRM coming soon is going to cover changes to the gainful employment and OBBBA accountability program, and also the Workforce Pell program, and how eligibility for that program should work. So there are a variety of different things here to cover on. I won't get into a lot of the weeds here, but there are a lot of complicated ways in which the department is going to roll up small programs by combining programs that are in the same SIP4 level or across different graduation years and things of that nature, that institutions might want to focus on, and just help the department understand how different some of those programs are, in kind of comment on the wisdom of whether combining them makes sense or not. Talking about changes to the financial value transparency framework. So what kinds of data elements might be particularly hard or easy to collect, and how the department might redefine or provide additional guidance around how those data elements should be collected. Those are all things that, again, could be helpful to the department. Um, uh, I won't go over the timeline here. Let me quickly just flag a few things that are up on our website, and then a document that was put out by the Brookings Institution about how to effectively comment on regulations, written by a former colleague of mine in the Obama administration, and then a few example comments that are all available on Peer's website. So all of this information is in the slides here. So let me wrap up, just in the interest of making sure there's a little bit of time to answer some of your questions. So Rowan, I'm
Yes.
happy to take questions if there are any.
Absolutely. So I'll just answer one really quickly. They were asking about if they'll get a copy of these slides because there's such good information in here. So within a week, registrants will receive presentation materials, a recording of this webinar and the materials. Jordan, there's a question. Are the transcripts, data requests, proposals, etc., from the negotiated rulemaking sessions considered to be part of the rulemaking record?
They are, yeah.
Okay. The guidelines that you have explained are very useful. The effect of any adjustment made on the students is a very pertinent point. I think this is just praise this one. So thank you for that comment. Other questions we have. How many people are usually working on a public comment together, and who from a university or other institution should collaborate? How much time should they be spending on these comments?
So that can vary a lot. That can vary a lot. I mean, the department gets thousands and thousands of comments. Many of them are just by a single individual who, um, might anyway. So we get all types of people. There's no one kind of standard type of comment, but from an institution's perspective, I think a lot of institutions organize within themselves to submit a comment that often comes from the president's office, like on a kind of high level take on how like a proposed regulation will affect them. Um, I think there are kind of two thoughts on this. I mean, the department is very careful. There are a lot of staff who review all of the comments, and any kind of comment that really delves into material in a really substantive way and puts together a lot of information that people in the department view as being really substantive and kind of helpful to explain an issue gets attention, like regardless of where it's from. But there's also kind of a like more like stakeholder oriented review to things. So, I think it helps like automatically get your comment elevated to higher levels of department leadership, and that they'll more likely be aware of it if there are a lot of people who are contributing to a comment, just because, the department's aware that kind of a lot of people endorse like a particular concern or set of issues that are in a comment. So a lot of comments come in through associations, through just groups of college presidents who might get together on a particular topic from a particular sector. And the more people who are kind of co-signing the letter, might be written by just one person, but endorsed by many. That will generally guarantee that the comment just gets higher level attention, like from within the department. But there's no requirement for that. Like I said, like the people who are really in the belly of working on the regulation within the department will see like almost all the comments that are really substantive. So just as a single person, like kind of providing some what could be very brief commentary to the department, to the extent that it's substantive, it'll be read and it could have an impact.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Beyond submitting a single comment, what longer term strategies should institutions or organizations consider to position themselves as advocates in federal rulemaking, particularly when it comes to policies that, affect students?
Yeah, I think one thing I would suggest is during the rulemaking process itself. So once the department has published its intent to hold rulemaking procedures around a particular set of issues, it's actually becomes a little bit difficult for the department to have really candid conversations with stakeholders, especially the institutions that will be regulated entities. There's a very constricted process through which the department is allowed to have those conversations. The rules are generally that the content of those conversations needs to be public information. So there needs to be some sort of summary, like about the interactions that are had over different topics, or the interaction needs to be through these formal 12866 meetings, which I didn't talk about today, but as part of the regulatory process, there are formal meetings that are held between agency staff, the Office for Management and Budget, and anybody who wants to come in and have a conversation. But those are all, again, like pretty scripted conversations where it might be hard to kind of really delve into the details in a more sustained way. So one thing that I would suggest is, just to the extent that that the department is going to be working on particular regulatory actions, but they haven't announced that already, then kind of sustain communication early. It is a great way of being able to have like a slower, lower stakes conversation with the department, where the department is going to be a little bit freer in its ability to really ask you for your views on how something might be changed, really ask you for additional kinds of information that it might find helpful. So if there's anything I'd recommend, it's just kind of getting ahead of these issues and trying to forecast what regulatory actions the department might be considering, and try to schedule meetings with the relevant staff who will lead those efforts early. Um, because that again can really shape like the contours of how the department approaches an issue.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Thank you to everyone who joined today. We'll see you at the next webinar. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.